Today's episode, Natalie and I interviewed David Holmgren, who's the co-originator of the permaculture concept, following the publication of Permaculture One, co-authored with Bill Mollison in 1978. David's globally recognized as a leading ecological thinker, teacher, writer, and speaker promoting permaculture as a realistic, attractive, and powerful alternative to dependent consumerism. David lives at Melliodora in central Victoria, Australia, on the unceded land of the Djaara People. David's work, the permaculture concept, has continually inspired Natalie and I to take small and slow steps towards ecological stewardship, and I think you're going to get a lot out of this episode. But before we get to the interview, here's a few words from our podcast sponsor, Nutrition with Confidence.
Hey everyone, my name is Natalie and I'm the founder of Nutrition with Confidence. If you are fascinated by holistic health ideas and trying to improve your own symptoms, you are in the right place. You might also be feeling overwhelmed by conflicting health advice, struggling with consistency, or just too fatigued to create a strategic plan for your health goals. If so, I invite you to get the help you need from one-on-one guidance with your own functional nutritional therapy practitioner. At Nutrition with Confidence, or NWC, we understand the frustration of sifting through endless information, trying to find what works. We know how challenging it is to follow through on health protocols and the fatigue that comes with not knowing where to start, if it's even working, or how or when to shift gears. That's why we are here to empower you to build confidence in your own body's incredible ability to heal itself. Our unique approach helps you reconnect with yourself. Imagine having a safe, supportive connection with your team that truly values you and calms your nervous system. Whether you're dealing with chronic health issues, looking to optimize your nutrition, or just want to have a healthier lifestyle, NWC provides personalized strategies tailored to your needs. We don't just treat symptoms, we address the root cause of your health concerns. And the best part, every member of our team is passionate about your journey. We're not just experts in the diets and nutrition therapy, we are partners in your healing, guiding you every step of the way. If you are ready to become confident in your health, visit nutritionwithconfidence.com and discover how we can help you harness the healing power of nutrition. Thanks for listening and stay healthy and confident until.
All right, David, thanks for being on the podcast today. I think a great place to start is just with a definition of permaculture. So, in a nutshell, what is permaculture?
Hmm. Yeah, well, permaculture can be defined in lots of different ways, but I generally describe it as a design system for resilient living and land use, and at the same time, resilient and regenerative. So it's concerned with both the production side of the equation, where we get our basic needs from a working relationship with nature, and how we live and organize ourselves and make use of all those things through all our living arrangements, right through to, you could say, institutions and structures in society. So it's really covering a huge spectrum, but its origins can be said to be potentially historically a branch off the tree of organic agriculture. In its origins in the 1970s, both Bill Mollison and I were very embedded in the one of the waves of emergence of organic farming, which of course had its origins much further back in the 1930s and 40s.
Mm. And in your book, we've read it's a short, I think 30-page book, Essence of Permaculture. I'm remembering the title right. You write, this focus in permaculture on learning from indigenous cultures stems from these cultures having existed in relative balance with their environment and surviving for longer than any of our more recent experiments in civilization. And I was wondering if you could share a bit more about how you began to learn about indigenous cultures, learn from indigenous cultures.
Mm. Well, I suppose when I met Bill Mollison, he had just actually completed the family lineages of the Tasmanian Aborigines, which were thought to be extinct. Um, and the descendants of those people, he had academically um, traced all their lineages and met all those people scattered across southern Australia, not just Tasmania. And so he had that connection, but we were also academically looking at, okay, what were the systems of management in so-called hunter-gatherer peoples who apparently, from a Western point of view, just wandered around the landscape and didn't actually manage it or intervene. And we were discussing and interested in those ideas, especially that of Australian ecologist and anthropologist Rhys Jones, who in 1972, a couple of years before I met Bill Mollison, coined the term fire stick farming to describe Indigenous land use in Australia, which was sort of an early revival of observations that had been made by early explorers that these people are just not randomly, lighting fires.
Yeah.
They are actually engaged in a sophisticated land management system, and that observation had been lost for hundreds of years, effectively, for quite political reasons why it had been expunged. So there was those aspects, and also looking at polycultures around the world of more quite concretely agricultural or horticultural garden agricultural systems, especially in the tropics, that were still in existence in many places, especially not far to the north of Australia in the highlands of New Guinea. So some of that was coming from those sort of connections that Mollison had to some of those people who were very fragmented from, their traditions, but still had elements of that. And also the crossover, I would say, in the modern world between just traditional rural bush people anywhere, including white settlers who'd only been in Tasmania and Australia for a few generations, that their culture was actually closer to Indigenous culture than it was to a lot of urbanized modernity.
Yeah.
So rather than seeing just the invader culture as this foreign thing, which it very much was, from the modern perspective, any rural people actually had a lot of elements still that through our own lineages we could discover a connection to land and nature. So this idea that permaculture explained to many traditional, older, rural, more self-sufficient people, at least in my experience in the 1980s, they would say, well, isn't that just common sense?
Yeah.
And I'd say, well, a lot of permaculture, not all of it, but some of it is common sense, but it's no longer common.
Yeah.
So in that
Wow.
sense, permaculture was not just learning from possible insights from long Indigenous traditions, but also the rediscovery of our grandmother, grandfather common sense.
I love that. It's like a remembering of that knowledge that's been lost.
Yeah. And an interesting anecdote in that regard, I suppose Australia, as one of the most modern, early industrialized, colonized by the first proto-industrial power,
Yeah.
in the beginning of the 18th century, and by 1900 being the richest country in the world per head of population. In a sense, we're a place, even perhaps more than the United States or as much, disconnected from a lot of those things by the effects of modernity. So that rediscovery here was often a multi-generational thing going back, but also learning from migrant peoples who were still closer connected to land. And in both our countries, that migrant culture bringing some sort of connection to land has been important. And I remember many years ago, decades ago, having a young Japanese woman volunteer who had been in Australia for a year and staying at various permaculture and related properties. And I said to her, what is the thing you've learnt most importantly in your time in Australia? And she said, to go home and talk to my grandmother.
Mm, that's amazing.
Because, in modern affluent Japan, there's still this, not too far back, there's, especially in rural areas, there's this strong retention of traditional culture and knowledge about food and health and land that still exists.
Mhm. Why, if someone were to tell you, like, oh, that's not very important, like, how could you convince someone, or what would you ask them to try to share? Like, what's the problem with not doing that, or why is this so important to remember these kinds of
Yeah. Well,
ways?
I think that gets to some of the assumptions that were built into permaculture from the beginning. Of course, I met Bill Mollison 2 years after the Limits to Growth report was published, and 1 year after the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East triggered a rise in oil price from $5 a barrel to $40 a barrel, which triggered the first substantial recession in the Western economies after the post-war economic boom, and showed up this huge vulnerability of society to dependence on fossil fuels, which were obviously depleting in some way, and how that report was sort of thrust into the public consciousness and really influenced environmental thinking at the time, which was in a surging process of growth, both in an oppositional sense to bad things happening in the world, but also in the creative sense of ideas like organics and permaculture. So what came through that was a view of the future of one that I later defined or characterized as energy descent, that each generation into the future, instead of having more power over nature and more energy and material resources to continue creating more and more complexity and separation from nature, that future generations would have less. And therefore, the design rules, if not the exact patterns of societies that existed before the pulse of fossil fuel, would be more the pattern. So, for example, relocalization of economies and cultures rather than continuing globalization, and many, many other patterns. So that's why it was essential from that perspective to say, well, we will need to develop some version of things that are attuned to actual physical and energetic realities, which was a huge conflict with the idea of invincible human material progress, which is, very strong, shows up in all civilizations that have this sort of pulse of resources, but in the modern world, it's a very deep religion.
Absolutely. So I wonder if you could kind of briefly name, I guess, some of the principles of permaculture?
Yeah.
And
Well, I suppose first it's important to recognize that in Permaculture One that was published in 1978, there's no clear list of permaculture principles. Um, they're implicit in the text, and even when you get to Mollison's Encyclopedic Designer's Manual a decade later, the Permaculture Designer's Manual, there's laws of necessitous use and various principles. It's only when you get to the introduction of permaculture, which it's Bill Mollison with Rennie Slay, but actually Rennie Slay was the main author, distilling 10 years of permaculture teaching through the 80s and actually influenced by various American contributors. Is there in the Mollison lineage of permaculture teaching a sort of clear list of design principles? And then when I came back to permaculture, in a sense, from being an observer of the emerging movement for 10 years and teaching principles in the 90s, I started to sort of tweak and refine that framework, which then became published in 2002 in Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. And there's many different iterations and explanations of permaculture principles, but over the last 25 years, that framework has become quite consolidated. And a lot of people have found, oh, this applies beyond gardening and farming. So starting with observe and interact is teaching us to unlearn some of the things that we've learned through modernity, especially of education. Ironically, that to learn something, we need to have our heads opened and the knowledge poured in. Whereas in fact, reviving that childlike and that deep pattern in our cultural forebears of to learn by directly observing. And in fact, all animals that survive and thrive do so by observing, and not just observing, but constantly interacting with their environment. So that is absolutely essential to sort of rediscover those skills through skills like reading landscape. And then recognizing that all of these principles that are embedded in natural systems, we can see them operating in ecologies, and then we can see them expressed through Indigenous and traditional culture, and we have to work out how to do those things appropriately in our own context, which is obviously different because the principles don't give you any sort of answers. So catching and storing energy, and energy is, of course, if you like, a currency for all resources that are necessary for an organism or for a system to survive, that those resources are not available in a steady flow. So you need to store them. Our bodies do that with fat over the winter. You know, one of the highest energy density forms in nature, energy density equivalent to diesel, actually, body fat.
I love it.
And that, you know, the seasonal storage of traditional agricultures in temperate climates, of the abundance of summer stored through preserves for the lean times. And we see it very basically in nature of the pulse of photosynthesis during the day in plants, and then respiration at night, the storing energy and then consumption of it. Whereas the modern world has made the supply of basic needs so reliable through regular wages, going to the shop each week and getting half a dozen tomatoes right through the year, that modern people start to think that that's actually a normal thing. So this pulsing, adapting to this pulsing nature and thinking about that in, we could say, in a financial econometric sense of thinking about investment for the future rather than just now. But also the other principle that goes with that is to obtain a yield. So we need to eat today if we're going to be able to plant the forest for the grandchildren. So which is sort of like capitalism distilled down to one principle amongst 12. And then that's balanced by principles like diversity, where we don't put all our eggs in one basket. The idea in agriculture of polyculture rather than monoculture was very foundational in permaculture. And the idea of integrated systems by default rather than segregation. In the modern world, we've tended to segregate functions. Firstly, in the industrialized cities, because the blacksmith shop in the village had turned into a giant satanic mill that was killing people with pollution. So let's put the houses over there and they can commute each day on trains to the factory over here, segregating things that otherwise would be in conflict. And segregation is actually a strategy in nature. It does exist, but by default, things tend to be integrated. And a really interesting example of that is that, for the average modern person, the idea that there's farms for animals and there's farms for growing crops seems, yeah, that's okay. You don't have in nature animal ecosystems and plant ecosystems separate. They're integrated. So all of those 12 design principles can be seen in natural ecosystems, in traditional and indigenous ways of organizing things, and then they are sort of memory tools to check when we're operating at the more specific level in design with strategies and techniques. How is what we're doing fitting into this larger framework? And I think it's interesting that a lot of people in other fields, including the health field, have gone, oh yeah, well, this applies in our field, or there's a resonance there with some of those things.
Yeah, especially with nutrition, it's kind of part of my mission actually I can't do my job well unless I get people reconnected with nature, and like the health of a person is directly correlated with the health of the food system that they're connected to. So it's just that's what nutrition is. And it's funny that we separate agriculture and nutrition when they're so interconnected.
Well, of course, in saying permaculture was a branch off the tree of organic agriculture, that lineage is really important. And I think the organic slogan that I remember that was so much part of those pioneers that I met in the 70s, but their forebears and writers in the 1930s and 40s was healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy people. And those ideas, organic farming was not separate from the issues of integrated holistic approaches to health. And, so although a lot of people might not necessarily make that obvious connection in permaculture, I think it's very much there in the origins, and it's also there in the modern scientific battle that's gone back and forth without people necessarily being aware of it, between germ and terrain theory of disease. So what my observation has been is that in soil science, right through to gut microbiology, there's been this gradually the scientific view that, health is actually composed of a full balanced ecosystem, not a sterile one. you know, and starting with things like in horticulture, you know, the extremes of industrial horticulture, to grow healthy plants, first sterilize the soil mix with carbon tetrachloride, and then your plants can just freely get all the nutrients without any of those nasty pathogenic organisms, which of course creates an open field for the invasion of pathogenic organisms, whereas healthy soil is actually composed of all these beneficial organisms, a full um, ecosystem. And the science behind that has become very well established. So I think there's a parallel across all of these areas. I wasn't until relatively recent decades aware of, I can't even remember who the name of the French whether he was a microbiologist at the same time as Pasteur, who developed the terrain theory that health is a result of the environmental balance.
Is it Bachamp?
Yeah, I think so. And obviously there's validity and usefulness in understanding agents of disease, you know, whether it's in human health or in forest. Yes, those trees are dying directly of armillaria, a root fungus, which is killing those trees. But why is it killing those trees and not these others, or whatever? Because the armillaria is everywhere in the forest. So those ideas, I think, are very relevant to assert today, because we've had a massive pushback in my observation in the field of health as a result of COVID and its discontents of sort of suddenly, let's sterilize everything, you know, and the germ agent, this is the cause of everything. And so that's a huge backward step, which, you know, you can say it's just part of the way these things flux and flow. But I think permaculture has definitely been in that sense of health is in natural ecosystems, in gardens, and right through logically into ourselves, aligning with those ideas of full and balanced ecologies rather than sterile ones. You know, and for me, that's also personal, because my partner in life, Sue Dennett, when she had her first son born in hospital in Sydney in 1972, he got golden staph in the hospital and then was given antibiotics. And when I met Sue, he was 9 years old and was just at a point where he could start to eat relatively normal things and go to the odd party and eat junk food and not destroy his gut. After Sue using macrobiotics and other approaches to recover his gut flora being destroyed at birth through the antibiotics, which were there to deal with an organism which had been created by the sterile environment of hospitals, that overuse of antiseptic had created golden staph even back then. So that lived experience of the downsides of being too successful at what is a natural and sensible objective of all people, to make an environment clean. And what it illustrates is a design problem, is when we get too powerful and successful at doing something which is sensible, but then we do it to such extremes where it starts to create worse problems. So I think that is a deep structural problem with having a lot of power. And this, I think, applies with, you know, modern interventionist health in the same way that it applies in the landscape. That, yeah, you know, like we can make all these synthetic fertilizers and we can use huge tractors and plow the soil to a deeper level. Yeah, all of those things weren't necessarily bad in some sort of limited way.
Right.
But so I think that design, I would see that as a design problem, not just for humanity, but even in nature. When there's too much power, things get done too big and they start to create different problems.
Yeah. Wow.
And I
Andy?
wanted to track back to that concept of separation. You know, when you were talking about we've got the livestock over here, right, in the feedlot, and then we're going to do the vegetables over here. To me, you know, I see obvious problems with that, but for someone who's not as familiar with agriculture, like what are the problems of that separation? And then I also am curious if you could share about like what is the role of animals and animal input in a permaculture system.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that in any agricultural system, like in any landscape, there's a limited amount of concentrated plant material with small enough amounts of fiber and toxic or undesirable materials for animals like humans that live on the sort of more concentrated good parts of biomass to eat. There's this huge amount of biomass, firstly, which is wood, and secondly, there's all this other biomass that can only be eaten by animals with more adapted digestive systems, such as four stomachs. And there's this small amount of stuff that is actually good for us to eat. And that also has concentrated levels of mineral nutrition enough to support our huge demands, especially our large brain. Like all animals high up on the food chain, we have that need for mineral nutritional density, which occurs in seeds and fruits and growing tips of special parts of relatively special plants. So that means just as a byproduct of attempting to grow those things, there's a whole lot of other biomass just comes out of our gardens, you know, in weeding. What can usefully use that? Well, animals, and whether it's you know peasant peoples with fat rabbits in cages being fed the weeds out of their garden, or whether it's you know, sheep grazing the grass. There's that ability of animals to process and use things that we can't use. So that complementarity. And that then carries over into how do we manage landscape, biomass in landscape, without relying on fossil fuel, fire, herbicide.
Yeah.
Well, there's our own labor, you know, cutting plants back and doing things. But animals are one of those big tools that our ancestors used, big munchers, you know, managing the landscape to make it open, fire safe, all of the different things. And then the other side, of course, is that animals are contributing manure to the landscape as fertilizing, stimulating that growth. And it's a feedback loop. And of course, it needs to be in the right balance. Otherwise, it actually degrades the land. So that cycle, if you look at it from the other point of view of saying, oh, well, we can get that incredible mineral nutrition and everything more easily, actually eating animals that have been eating plants because they've done a lot of the concentration. And that gathering together of that sometimes is easier, say, for example, eating a pig that's been eating the acorns rather than us gathering the acorns and leaching the tannin out of it and eating the acorns. And that we get all this fat and other beneficial nutritional things. So obviously our ancestors in most places have done both of those things. In extreme environments, people have lived on largely just animals, like Inuit peoples and whatever. And then at the other extreme, when we have, especially in the tropics, but in very minerally rich, fertile valley systems, where civilizations over long periods of time have built up very dense populations, people have tended to have more plant-based diets and less animal food. Especially in India and China and Asia, that pattern became quite strongly established. And because it's ecologically works better, and also plant foods tend to be more minerally balanced in those geologically young, naturally fertile areas where the mineral base in the soil is still strong, unlike places like Australia and parts of Africa and other parts, even parts of the United States, where the infertility of soils, the loss of those minerals mean that it's a bit harder to get that balanced nutrition from plants. So those things have affected how our ancestors have done stuff in different places. But if we look at it from the modern point of view, and the overeating of meat and the using fossil fuels directly and indirectly to creating animal feedlots, you end up with this huge byproduct of animal manure, which is stinking and gassing off greenhouse gas emissions and whatever, which is needed back over where the plants are grown. So you need to sort of move that across. Oh, well, you don't bother because you're using artificial fertilizers, and then that just becomes a form of pollution. So that obviously you need to get the animals and the plant systems back integrated and at smaller scales. And of course, that actually addresses the horrendous animal welfare things of large centralized systems that, from our personal point of view, we've refused to participate in any of that world for our whole adult lives. We never bought meat that has gone through the central abattoir system. And I think that debate about animals, it is possible to have vegan permaculture systems. I was quite personally challenged on a tour we did in '94, a teaching and study tour in Europe, and the last place we stayed was a small farm in Sweden where they grew all of their own food, and they were using Fukuoka type methods of direct sowing without ploughing. And they did have animals, horses and pigs, but they were just pets. And for me, that was actually quite a challenge. Oh, this is very difficult to do, not have animals as part of the diet and part of the essential part of the system. They were still there as part of the system for their services, if you like, the ecological services, including being friendly animals. So it is possible to arrange things in all sorts of ways, but I've also said that there's a complementarity between different cultural diets and personal dispositions, that it's not necessarily best for everyone to do exactly the same thing. And that there can be complementarities between those differences in the way land is managed, and obviously in that issue of the role of animals. But it is one that a lot of people who are interested in permaculture find very contentious. Bill Mollison used to be a bit scathing in his critique of vegetarians, let alone vegans. I'm more modest in that. And yeah, it just recognizing that some way or another, animals are part of the system, and that includes actually all the wild animals, right? You know, that you can't think about an ecosystem as just plants.
I used to be vegetarian for and actually vegan for a long time, and then I I was doing it mostly for the environment, and then the more I learned that you can't grow really good healthy soil or plants from healthy soil without animal input, then I realized like, okay, there needs to be a better way. And it makes me think of the permaculture principle of the problem can be the solution. And
Mm,
using that, it just makes sense of, okay, the reactionary of, oh, I don't want to eat animals because they're not treated well in our society and we don't have the right system set up. Well, that's reactionary. And what are the impacts of that to my health and also like other it's not like I can change that, but one way I could change it is actually putting effort into uh, gathering or supporting local farmers who are doing it the way that I want it to be
mm,
done. And
yep.
if we can keep working towards connecting those two parts of our system of like, there's the problem of the manure building up and how can we connect that to soils that need fertilizer?
Mm,
How can we do that? Maybe we can, or maybe
mm.
it needs to be rethought altogether. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting dilemma that I addressed in Principles and Pathways, and used an example of a innovative intensive piggery that was using the energy from the manure to run the intensive system, and then also making composts which were sold. And but when I sometimes, if you look at a system like that, you can say that is making that intensive system more sustainable. But when we step back, say, does it actually make sense to have pigs in buildings and be growing grain somewhere else that's brought to them when pigs, by their nature, are foraging animals? And so, for their well-being, they need to be able to do what pigs do, and they're great at gathering. I mentioned the acorns, but waste food and whatever where it occurs. And so in a lower energy society, those systems will redevelop of pigs in that more integrated role. And the intensive system, even in its refined, more sustainable way, will be done out of business because, the waste streams that it's commandeering or depends on won't actually be available. And in some ways that starts with, oh, the low grade grain on the farm is actually supporting some pigs rather on a smaller scale, rather than being shipped, to those centralized systems. So that issue of how these principles can be applied to at different levels, and that sometimes it's inevitable that as greater pressures of ultimately energy cost and resources, that simpler, more holistic, integrated ways will displace those systems. And we can think of it in terms of, waste collection systems that in our country are being accelerated since China hasn't been accepting our waste, and now there's green bins of people putting their waste. But if people are home composting and trying to maximize food growing at home, sorry, that green waste supply and the compost they're making from it, it's got greater risks of contamination, and there's great truck coming around picking it up. It just actually makes more sense for the householder to do it on
Right.
site.
Right.
So in that sense, that small, flexible system actually takes the resources away from those big centralized systems, in the same way that those small systems in permaculture parasitize off the wastes that that larger system generates. So, for example, one of the classic techniques associated with permaculture in early days, so much that people thought permaculture was mulching when permaculture was first popularized in Australia. So deep sheet mulching to establish a garden from scratch over grass and weeds is a great way to use accumulated biomass, but that biomass is a byproduct of a wasteful society that has all this stuff to throw away. So it's not necessarily sustainable in some perpetual sense, but it's a great opportunity to make use of what those systems are wasting. And it's the same when people go to the rubbish tip and get some discarded steel or materials to make something rather than going to the hardware, or people getting their clothes from the op shop. It is a form of parasitism of the consumer society, but it's actually an appropriate adaptive strategy. And clearly it's not sustainable if everyone got their clothes from the op shop and there was no textile industry. Well, we'd probably have enough clothes for another 2 decades anyway, whereas food, we need to grow it every year.
Yeah, it's amazing how much is in every box store, and it's like, so many clothes, and they're all plastic too. They're mostly
Well,
plastic.
so we can be more selective and only only at the op shop only get the natural fiber things. Yes, so I think there's so many ways in which, as we learn to reconnect to those sources that are reflecting our values and rebuilding those local connections between consumer and producer. The ultimate radical reconnection is the consumer and the producer are the one person. And that idea of self-sufficiency was, as it was called in the 1970s, was there in permaculture that people would often associate with terms like off-grid living these days, but one of the important aspects of that I emphasize in my RetroSuburbia work is the idea of the household economy as the key foundation for any larger economy in society. And doing things at the household level works best when there's more than 1 or 2 people, because there's more jobs and things to do, and there's greater efficiencies of cooking for 5 people rather than 1 person is so much more energetically efficient. And so right through to nutrition and many other aspects of health, those things, health is not something which is maintained out in some professionalized, centralized system. It's primarily maintained at the household level, created at the household level. So this idea of rebuilding household economies, which have been largely withered away or lost in the modern world, is a core idea in permaculture that, as I said, relates to those 2 ideas, the old one from the 70s of self-sufficiency and the more current off-grid living, of how do we do more things at that most localized scale. And I think health is incredibly related to that. And of course, right through to psychological and emotional health, that a whole lot of the loneliness epidemic and yes, it's important to have other connections in our community and don't want to sort of underplay those larger things. But sometimes I find environmental and social activists coming to permaculture think in terms of the individual and the community, and forget that we all live in some sort of household, and that often miss that how do we strengthen that foundation. And ironically, that idea seems to have been challenging for people on the environmental and social justice left of the political spectrum, I might say. And I don't know why, maybe because it's associated with right, socially conservative people valuing family values or something. But people on that spectrum, more on that view, get that idea usually very clearly. But it has been part of my RetroSuburbia work based on, permaculture principles of how do you rebuild this household economy. And I deliberately call it a household rather than family, to say that, households can form in all sorts of different ways, but history suggests that the extended multi-generational family that most of our ancestors lived in was a pretty natural and obvious sort of form, and it probably will be the dominant form for our descendants as well in some form or another, even though the process of getting there will involve many blended families and households in all different forms, as there were. We don't need to go back very far in Australia, even, that in the 1920s, many households had borders, single people that were living, in a larger household. So I think that very much connects to health in lots of practical ways of maintenance of health, right through to emergencies, minor medical emergencies that are all dealt with at that level, rather than rushing off to centralized systems.
I think of kind of the state of emergency of our health systems, especially like, during 2020 COVID times, like we had to see that actually, that we needed to maybe think more preventatively, household, how can I triage things at home first before I go in and go to an overwhelmed hospital. And, that really created a big awareness, I think, for a lot of people. Unfortunately, it took that kind of situation because, thinking about nutrition with health in the household, I think most people don't end up pursuing nutrition, unfortunately, until they're at an emergency state. But you wish that we'd all be doing this just because. But that leads me to asking if you could share more about the impetus of your book, RetroSuburbia, to get more into that.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of permaculture initially was on what architects and planners call greenfield sites. Someone starting on a so-called blank site and building a house and gardens and developing something. And then you can look at examples like eco-villages of intentional communities and the crossover of those ideas through into more mainstream sustainability ideas of eco-cities, and this process of turnover of firstly building stock is something that takes decades, if not centuries. So yet we're running into the multiple environmental crises, what some people are calling the poly crisis, what I've called energy descent, that we're actually going to be stuck with a lot of stuff that already exists, that we're going to be adapting and retrofitting a whole lot of existing buildings. And in fact, when we think outside of the built environment and all the infrastructure, and we think about the biological environment, gardens, farms, landscapes already exist. You know, they already have trees in them and different things. So we're not dealing with blank slates. We're going to adapt something that already exists. And then we can cross that over into the big domain of our behavior, human behavior, which ultimately is the most flexible, adaptable of those three, the built, the biological, and the behavioral, that we're going to have to adapt, but live with the inherited stuff, the behaviors that we've inherited, both functional and dysfunctional from the past. And how do we adapt and move from those to something more appropriate? And so that's an incremental process where we do different things. There's little compromises, there's steps, there's a whole lot of learning cycles that develop through this retrofitting paradigm, rather than grand plans that we're going to create, dare I say, this 100% renewable energy grid that's all going to magically provide everything society has now, and it's going to be environmentally beneficial and have no problems. No, we're not. It's going to be a disaster because doing things bigger and faster when you're actually reaching the limits actually makes things worse. So smaller adaptive movements also work very well where society is not ready for some large scheme that people don't trust, for in some ways very good reasons, big schemes driven from above. And so working with what you've got, and of course the suburban landscape, or the pattern of separate houses on little blocks of land, not just in the suburbs surrounding our mega cities, but also in all the small country towns and villages of countries like the United States and Australia, is where vast numbers of people live and where they'll have to adapt in situ to changes that are coming. And so that makes more sense than either we're going to build these gleaming new eco-cities, or we're all going to leave and move to some remote rural location. And so that focus on the retrofitting paradigm and on suburbia as actually an opportunity rather than a problem has been a big part of my work for at least the last 25 years. But it precedes that. When we moved to a small country town in 1985, our intention was actually to buy a house and renovate it and have a modest block. But in the town we'd selected, it was fairly small. And when we ran through all of our criteria, we actually couldn't find a house that suited. So I said to Sue, well, got the skills of building, got the tools, maybe we'll buy a vacant block, and ended up building a passive solar mud brick house. But that idea of retrofitting has sort of been with me as a strategic aspect to permaculture from a long time back.
And I'm so drawn to your thinking there of working with what already exists, right? We'll have to adapt as time goes on and we enter into this energy descent, and that principle of small and slow change. I know in internal family systems, I have training, and we have this concept of protective parts of us that go to extremes. And I've thought of those concepts a lot as you've been talking, with these parts of us that want to control, and these parts come out of experiences of trauma. I'm kind of getting on a side
Right.
tangent here, but going back
No,
to that
no.
small and slow change, I think it
Yeah.
integrates so well with the lived experience Natalie and I have from responding to the symptoms we've had that have been largely related to, I think, stress, I think like modern toxin exposure and our food system, right? The highly processed sugary foods. And I love that concept of small and slow changes because it's overwhelming to, like you said, think of these grand ideas for how to address these huge ecological problems we're facing, these huge health issues we're facing. But really, it's those small, slow changes that we make for our health and for the health of the community. I think that really propel us as a community towards better health and better connection. And so, I just
Mm.
what you're saying really resonates with me.
Yeah, well, that of course is that principle in permaculture, like all of the other principles, they're overturning an embedded mindset in the modern mind of big is better and fast is better than slow. And now the idea that big is better has had a bit of knockback over the decades, but the romance of fast has been certainly accelerated by the information technology revolution. And that slowing down, I think, is obviously through many issues of health, mental health, but in so many ways of not trying to do a million different things all at once. And the very basic idea in plant, animal health, and human health that super accelerated growth from overstimulated food growth, actually, we know from intensive feedlot animals, leads to an incredibly short life expectancy, and that, yeah, fast growth is not actually necessarily healthy in children. So that a lot of those things of, yeah, reducing things to smaller scale, and the learning cycle that comes from that, because that means that there's still the capability of what people call scale. How does this solution actually scale? Well, gardens don't keep growing. A successful garden doesn't grow from a quarter acre to an acre to 10 acres to 100 acres and take over the landscape. Now, what happens is a successful garden spins off plants and seeds that create another garden.
Mm.
So replication is a way that scale can be achieved. But yeah, how does this small solution actually do anything to these larger problems? So those small examples, and I think this applies in health also, that people see a model of someone doing something, overcoming deeper problems they have, especially when there's that intimacy with relatives, friends, family. They see something, and sometimes there's that, I can maybe do something influenced by that. And often I think people are influenced when they see something from above that they consider some sort of authority or expert, but they see it sideways or from below, from someone who is just ordinary to them, but in their field. Oh yeah, that idea. So these things do come a bit from that combination of top down and bottom up together. But the idea of all of those things being possible to have more modest changes and doing things in moderation. I think sometimes in the health area, there tends to be this swing of, whether it's a swing from a vegan diet to a pure paleo diet. Well, wait a minute. Yes, that might work for some people in some context, but but so that balance is part of what comes, I think, with the small and slow solutions. And that doesn't preclude those changes being quite radical and fundamental, because they often start with a small seed of something, like people going, how do I just simplify my life and get rid of some things that I apparently need or are addicted to, and just start with something that's really bugging me, and then that process can often build incrementally, and people shedding away things that are unnecessary in their lives or are actually in some ways damaging or toxic to them.
I'm curious if you saw a difference in your health as you started to live this way. And
yeah, well, for me, I don't think there's been any sort of exact point in that, because I grew up in a family where, my mother bought wholemeal bread from this particular baker, and we had I had dried fruit and fresh vegetables in my lunch at school that kids thought was very weird in the mid-60s in Australia. So, and I can remember discussions in the 80s about school providing junk food, and my mother saying, I thought we won that battle in the 1960s. So these things go in cycles, and although her understanding of health and everything was just within the context of those times, I felt I already was raised, with a healthy diet, and the ideas of permaculture. I was 19 when I met Bill Mollison, when he was 43, I think. And, I was already an organic gardener and into ecological hunting and, on this path that became permaculture. And so, but I think with aging, there's things that have shed or changed, and one was the growing intolerance to modern processed wheats and things like that, almost becoming what we call a glutard, which is, of course, an epidemic. But
join the club there, David. We're all in that
yeah,
together.
we found that, in fact, for me, eating spelt sourdough bread at home wasn't actually a problem. It was actually when I went out and was presenting somewhere, even in permaculture places, and consuming, industrial refined flours that were the problem. And, so some of the things also, problems that show up progressively with aging that you don't have tolerance to, so adjusting and sort of changing diet a bit, and I suppose also learning through very limited health crises that I've had, including a bad back in my 90s that I discovered was actually about carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders and having poor posture that was mostly in my head. And, working through those processes, including as someone with a sort of super rationalist lineage, being helped by kinesiologists who we used to call the local witch, helped through those problems. There's been, various things along the way that have reinforced the commitment to alternative and complementary ways of health. But in that I've been led more strongly by my partner, Sue Dennett, too, who had, as I mentioned, had been through various things and was much more radical in her skepticism. So, for example, our son, who was born in '86, like his older half brother and sister, weren't vaccinated. And in that, I was following, she was the leader in that area, even though I had perhaps more faith in conventional medical systems than she did. And I think actually over recent years, I've become more radicalized in that pathway. And my evidence about greater trust in science has sort of has actually been challenged a bit. But yeah, those so different approaches, whether approaches that come from the gut and emotion versus from the head, those balances of learning from those things and learning to slowly get in touch with your own intuitive capabilities, which I didn't think I had any ability in that, as I said, coming from that sort of super rationalist, overthinking things. So yeah, different journeys and ways along, but at 69, I feel the great privilege of both, good genetics and, being healthy and fit. And who knows, maybe I'll drop dead with cancer or whatever, but I'm largely outside the medical system, and you could say that, well, that's just fortuitous and luck, but it's also a result of, a deliberate strategy. And Sue's 8 years older than me, and sometimes people say, oh, you're young and fit and healthy. I said, yeah, it's keeping up with her.
Yeah.
So she still goes down the gully, taking the goats down with the slash hook to cut the blackberries and do what she says is her green gym work each day. So
I love
that's
it.
definitely, part of the way we live.
Yeah, I would say it's more than your genetics. It has to be just the principles you were, raised with and then holding on to them. It must have been, like your mom really passed down a lot more health principles that have served you. And I think I see a lot of that missing, especially the there was something you had said earlier about that made me think of the generational issues of how people are dealing with more and more health issues at younger and younger ages. And it was when you were speaking to the aging process, right? And now you also have some reactions to the gluten containing grains that are specifically from this centralized system. And so, yeah, it makes me think of, though, a lot of younger individuals who have been in this from the get-go, indoctrinated into the centralized systems. We can't get away with as much as, like, say, my grandmother, who's 90, who was introduced to more of these centralized systems later in her life. So she's, especially with food, she can still have a lot more than like I can get away with, and before I really feel it and notice.
Yeah, we're discovering all these accumulation of disadvantages of modernity
Yeah.
continue, whereas initially, they seem to provide really good things, which,
Right.
and, I don't disparage those things. I don't have a naive view of primitive romantic sort of view of, what the world was like magically in the past. But I think, you know, the accumulation of problems, that is also the mechanism that has in more recent years smashed that separation between nature and nurture, the environment, you know, or genetics, with epigenetics, that, yeah, the diet of your grandparents actually had some influence on your current health, and their trauma or whatever, actually, that these things carry over. So there's these accumulations, and that is both a benefit in terms of survival, of how people survived is actually in some ways passed on, but also the traumas and consequences of the past are there in us. So I think we're dealing with all of those things, and I think one of the big things with the limits of interventionist medicine is that it's been historically blind to ecological wisdom in saying, okay, what happens if you are successful in running full interventionist medicine and save everyone at birth who would otherwise die for 10 generations? What would the human genome look like after that? Well, we know from animal husbandry, you destroy the health through that process. And that raises like this very difficult dark area, because, oh, does that mean we should be engaged in something that would ultimately be called eugenics, you know, that we actually intervene to select? Well, actually, for our ancestors, they had limited ability to influence things, and that was in the hands of nature, the gods, or whatever, and that dilemma didn't come up. Well, I think in the future we're more likely to again be subject to nature, the gods, whatever, the consequences of our past behavior. It doesn't matter how you, whatever you call it, and that realigning with accepting, moving beyond a death-phobic culture, and not just in relation to aging, but also in relation to birth. The idea that every birth, you know, like must be perfect and live. Well, nature doesn't actually work that way. And so how do we, you know, the proverb, let nature take its course, is a pretty harsh one in a way, and we associate that with the principle, very interestingly, of use and value renewable resources and services. That when we work in this way with more natural things, we actually are not so much in control. And that can be sort of quite harsh. I mean, at a more humorous level, I talk about the classic permaculture idea of using chickens in the garden to scratch and eat pests and fertilize the soil, which is great, but, you know, when they get into the garden when you don't want, it's really annoying. Whereas the rotary hoe sits in the shed and stays there when you put it. It doesn't come out when you're not looking and start rotary hoeing the garden. So we shifted to these, you know, more technological and interventionist ways of doing things because it gave us more control. And in the process of moving back, because we have to, and because we recognize it's appropriate and better overall, it means we actually have to work with natural processes, and there's a degree of loss of control. And that, I think, is very, very challenging for the modern mindset. And I think a lot of health professionals are sort of unwilling to acknowledge those processes, and maybe it reflects the population generally. But having that putting that expectation on health professionals and health systems that somehow everything can be fixed and saved.
Yeah. David, will you, on that topic of relinquishing control and letting go, would you share a bit about that process for you in your life, or some examples of relinquishing control and letting go in moments?
Well, I think that has mostly happened for me. As I said, I've had a very fortunate life in terms of health and uh, well-being, even though you know, in my family there's been other things that you know, I had a brother who died of cancer at 51, and seeing his life pathway, but more at the practical level as a permaculture designer and project developer, that whole thing of having all the facts, having all the information, and effectively being a control freak to know that sometimes doesn't work anyway, even when you think you have all the understanding, and then to sort of see things that uh, uh, the consequences of your own actions. In our own place, Melliodora, my own overuse of dolomite lime at a critical period in the development of the property, there's still the echoes of that in distortion of trees and things that didn't work so well because I'd actually had a narrowed view of what I thought needed to be done, and over intervening in a system and intervening in the wrong way in the early 90s. And so for me, that was a pretty painful lesson, you know, when I was sort of gung-ho, this is going to be this great example of all the things in permaculture, and living with those consequences when you live with that, and oh, that's the food you're eating, and that some of those things that also reflected in being our own guinea pigs, and in our son's life, his teeth, you know, were a reflection of some of the mineral imbalances that I'd actually created and then fed to him. You
Oh,
know, so that sort of thing, even though it's sort of minor in the scheme of things, you know,
Amazing.
for me, they're those sort of yeah, an example of lessons of over control, or think you know what you're doing, and actually having to let go and actually also live with the consequences of what you've done.
Awesome.
well, David, thank you so much for your time. This has been such an engaging interview. I've taken so much away from what you've shared, and getting about to the end of the interview here. If people are interested in learning more about your work, where's a good place to direct them?
Yeah, well, the website holmgren.com.au has a lot of my writings and what we're doing, including teach online permaculture design courses with colleagues and other things. And through that, there's access to books and other material, including the RetroSuburbia, and of course, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, which has actually been translated into, I think, 9 languages now. And through their access to our online store, where we largely stay outside of the centralized corporate marketing systems, and have networks in the US too, at a small scale, to support what we do.
Well, thanks again, David, for your
Yeah.
time and generosity, and yeah, really appreciate your time.
Yeah,
Well,
I could ask you more questions like for hours. I need to attend like more of your class or lectures or something so I can do that.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
it's interesting in the RetroSuburbia book. The my partner says, "I'll go to the last section, the section on behavioural stuff, because that's all the difficult and the big questions." And in a lot of that, the distillation of that work are sort of very much influenced by her, even though I'm the one that's sort of uh, doing those things. But she's been persuaded to. She's doing an online thing that's called Do with Sue, which is mostly things in the kitchen and
Nice.
Oh,
whatever,
that's
and
great.
her wisdom and practicality that is, yeah, critical in that that health field that
Mhm.
we're all concerned with. And yeah, good luck with the podcast, and hope it all
Yeah.
goes well.